Well, good morning and welcome to you all. Great to see you all here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Martin Boddy. I'm Head of Research at the University of the West of England, which is the bigger university in North Bristol, for those of you who realise we've got two in the city. And I'm also, for today's purposes, remembering that I'm a Professor of Urban and Regional Studies and very excited by all the things that are happening here in the Festival of the Future City, which is part of the Bristol Festival of Ideas. The Festival of Ideas happens all year round, as you know, but we have 4 days to focus on the future city. We'd like to thank especially the Arts Council England, Innovate UK, Bristol City Council, and my own university, the University of the West of England, for supporting the Festival of the Future City for these few days. I'm advised that if you wish to tweet, use hashtag Future City, all one word in lowercase, 15, numbers 15, again, all in one go, Future City 15. The focus of this session is the future of world cities, and we have a stunning panel with huge experience of world cities to talk to you this morning. Let me just introduce all the panelists to you to start with. First of all, on my immediate right, Tim Moonen, who's from the Business of Cities. This is an organisation whose business is intelligence, knowledge and strategy for cities worldwide. Clients include Brookings Institute, OECD and many cities across the globe. Tim is going to start by setting the context for us in a couple of minutes. Susan Parnell from the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. Susan is an urban geographer and writer and has focused particularly on cities in the southern hemisphere. Next to Susan, Olamide Udoma from Future Lagos, which is an organisation focused on democracy and citizen voice in world cities. Lagos is one city in a network of a number of cities in this organisation, and Olamide will be talking about Lagos in that context. Last but by no means least, on the far end, Gary Younge, who is a writer, columnist for The Guardian and author. For many years, just fairly recently returned from the US, where he was The Guardian correspondent. And Gary will be focusing on the US experience, which is still obviously very, very fresh in his mind. What I'm going to do in terms of format is I'll invite each of our speakers to speak for no more than 10 minutes, and then we'll open up the conversation and invite you to join in. So without further ado, I shall invite Tim to replace me here and set the context for us, Tim.
Thanks, Martin, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to speak for a few minutes, really, about the global perspective, drawing on a couple of papers that we contributed to the Future of Cities Foresight project that the government has been running, principally looking at what the rest of the world is doing and thinking about the future of cities, and also drawing on a few other projects that we've been working on. They include the future of metropolitan areas, the urban investment priorities of the big global lending banks, and then also the quest for high quality density in cities. So what I'm going to do is summarize all of that body of work. I'm going to highlight 4 challenges that I think are widely shared and have been identified, and finish off by pointing to 2 or 3 imperatives that I think emerge out of that agenda. So really I'm going to start by stressing something we probably all intuitively recognise, which is that there's been a really big surge in attention and interest on the future of cities and the future of how they're going to prepare and to plan. There's an awful lot of strategising taking place, not just about the future of individual cities, but also across cities, across national and across regional systems. And I think there are 3 clear reasons for that. The first one is that, like it or not, cities are, I think, going to host the vast majority of economic growth and population growth in the next century, really. We already are fairly confident the world's going to be 70% urban by 2050. There's going to be more cities of all different sizes. And I think that although cities have already broken through 500 there are now 500 cities that are broken through 1 million people. That's going to rise up to potentially 800 by the end of the century. And so this really means that cities can no longer afford to be treated as problems to be contained, but really as places whose promise to some extent needs to be unlocked or certainly optimized. So that's the first reason. I think the second reason is that because cities are feeling the impact so strongly of climate change, of migration, of resource conflicts, and of course terrorism, as we saw last week, there's really pressure on cities to prepare for those kind of known unknowns, if you like, and thinking about the likely need to recover from some kind of unexpected set of events. The third reason, I think, is the fact that we've now really reached a point where we've got a much deeper awareness and knowledge base about the last 150 years really of urbanization and the successes, but certainly the failures as well that have happened in that time. And we think about the risks that cities have of entering into what we call in the jargon negative path dependency. So that means, for example, cities like Detroit, who might end up entering into becoming too narrowly specialized in one industry, for example, or cities whose governance is no longer fits the physical scale of the city that it's grown out to, say like New York or like Sao Paulo. Or cities that where the transport choices that were originally decided on 50 years ago quickly become outdated or become inefficient for a city. We can think of Birmingham or Los Angeles there. So those are some of the reasons why I think there's so much interest in the future of cities now. When we look at who's leading that inquiry, and that's what we did in our recent papers, we found that the global institutions and global organizations are really leading the agenda a lot more in that area. The World Bank's carried out 10 urbanization reviews now since the global financial crisis, trying to look at different countries and how they can become more productive. UN Habitat, OECD, the World Economic Forum, they're all doing an awful lot of work these days. I won't summarize all of that here, but what I'll just say is that what's clear is that the pace of change, although the pace of change is really variable across different regions and in different cities, almost all cities are in fact dealing with some element of growth and having to manage that. So if you look over the last 40 years, say, of the world's 1,000 largest cities, only 28 of them actually lost population in that time. And of those 28, Glasgow is in fact number 1 and Liverpool number 3. But what's striking is if you go forward, the current map of what the population will change is that a quite similar proportion, small proportion of cities will equally lose population, and almost all of those will be in the ex-Soviet states and in Japan. So that's the global level. At the national level, there's the last decade, national governments have become a little bit more interested they've shown a bit more appetite to manage the network of their cities, and not just aim to create balanced growth, but also try and create systems that don't undermine the most successful cities, which is something that often used to occur quite deliberately in the past. And it's increasingly common to see national urban strategies. We see it in China, we see it in Poland. Countries like Sri Lanka and Ethiopia are building spatial strategies around cities for the very first time. We're also seeing that governments are creating ministers or ministries for cities for the first time, or perhaps the first time in a long while. Australia only last month created its first Minister for Cities post in 40 years. That's the national level. At the city level, there's a lot of kind of scanning, sort of future scanning, or what you call scenario building, what future scenarios for cities. Examples might include Tokyo 2050, Delhi 2050. These kind of try and talk to citizens about what's the likely future behaviour change or demographic change that's going to take place in the city. How do you prepare for that? And new kinds of plans that sort of explain or advocate for what kind of growth is going to occur and how do you accommodate that. And some of you may know about the London 2050 infrastructure plan that tries to lay out how London will accommodate all that future growth. So all in all, there's a huge amount, as you can tell, of activity and some thought as well going into what the future of cities might look like. And I think it's clear that there's not going to be just one single future, not just going to be one single narrative about cities. There's so many different patterns of urbanization happening, the big mega regions we're seeing in China, to the urbanization corridors in India, to the compact cities in Central Europe. So, and each city is also at a very different stage of development. And so the future of cities, I think, means something different pretty much for every city and every every city as well in each cycle or in each wave of its development. So I think from all of this work, I think it's worth dwelling on just 4 shared challenges I think cities need to confront. The first one is how to ride change in the economy and change in globalization. So as different sectors globalize over time, if you think, say, finance and media became quite global in the 80s and 90s, then we had tourism, more recently higher education's become a lot more global, so has life sciences, things like that. This means that cities can't really avoid being thrown into some degree of competition with other cities in terms of in their national markets, regional or international systems. And if you think about, say, the Asia Pacific, for example, 20 years ago, you might have just looked at Tokyo, Hong Kong and Singapore as the 3 cities that really specialize in international kind of functions. But today there's more than 20 cities that are trying to compete in these different technology sectors, in different business services, tourism, entertainment and so on. And loads of other cities beneath that, all jostling for position for how their industrial production can, as global value chains become more and more kind of mobile and dynamic, and how they can position there. So what I think the point of that means is that if cities are going to pursue any kind of agenda around competitiveness, it means that they have to think a lot more in a lot more nuanced way about what kind of skills that their economy will need, what sort of business climate might be suited to the kind of things that they want to compete for, and what sort of spatial or infrastructure development will suit that. So I think that's the first key challenge. The second one is really how to manage what we call the kind of negative externalities of growth. So if you basically, all the cities that try and pursue this kind of growth agenda eventually come up against some sort of familiar series of problems. We might think of inflated costs, the unmet demand for housing, the opposition among property owners to new development in a city, the increased congestion in infrastructure, the increased security and sustainability risks, and the rise of what we're now calling the two-speed economy, where more and more people are in some way locked out of accessing good jobs, and a certain kind of resistance or hostility against what you might call pro-global or pro-market policies arises. And so for a lot of cities, they think one of the solutions about this is the imperative to densify, and in some way densify in a fair and inclusive way that it kind of escapes mistakes that were made in the past rather than exacerbates them. The third challenge that we've identified is the governance, the very big governance deficits that cities. How long have we got? 1 minute. Okay. Basically, cities exist in all kinds of arrangements that were created by historical accident rather than design, and there are very weak channels for coordination, very limited governing powers apart from a handful of cities like Singapore and Hong Kong, and a very siloed approach taken by national governments towards the sort of problems that cities need to think in an integrated way. The final challenge, I'd say, is the building of really proper fiscal and financial capacity in cities. There's all kind of handicaps against borrowing, against creating new instruments, and the effect of all of that is to discourage quite a lot of innovation and ambition at the local level, and a lot of cities are going to be stuck in that kind of underinvestment unless they can really find new kind of processes of reform and new kind of mechanisms. So I'll just conclude quickly on the 3 challenges or 3 imperatives and solutions, and then we'll start, Martin. Basically, the first tool we talk about is the long-term strategic planning, thinking in the long term as a metropolitan area in a strategic way, as one unit, as a place where cities can come together and design their futures collaboratively. That's key. The second one is on a similar scale, really, to build coalitions with your neighbouring authorities, with your citizens, with your business and civic leaders. Treat them as serious partners. The third one is really meaningful devolution and self-government, and I think lots of our panellists today, but also for the rest of the week, will be talking about that. So in conclusion, I'd say the world's really in a very short distance, a very short way down the journey of creating economically sustainable and coherently organised places. But I do think that the future of cities does hold out a promise to begin to start addressing poverty and disadvantage, to begin to start decoupling growth from wasteful energy use, and to begin to create integrated and fair development. So thanks very much indeed, and over to Sue.
But it's even more unfair to ask me to talk about a continent in 10 minutes. But I'm going to do that, and I want to, colleagues, ask you to take away perhaps just two really important points. One is that African cities are important in their own right. In other words, what happens in those cities is important. But also that what happens on the African continent in urban spaces is important for us collectively. In other words, we share an interest in what happens in the cities of Africa and in the future cities of Africa. And that's particularly important to say at this point, because this is the point where a continent where cities experience what we might think of as polycrises, numbers of crises that come together: water, sanitation, demography, the economy, war, violence, exposure to climate change, they all happen simultaneously, are happening in a context of very rapid transition. Radical transformation is taking place in all cities, but at a pace in Africa and at a level of complexity that makes it even more important what goes on in that place and context. And of course, we're talking about 54 countries, and so there are enormous variations across that place. In general, what we know is that between now and about 1950, the African urban population is going to expand by about 600 million people. Okay? More than double the number of cities of urban residents in Europe over the professional lifetime of the students that I currently train. Most of that's taking place in East and West Africa, which are the poorest parts of the continent. So we're talking about, just to begin to shift your headspace, we are talking about the urbanization of poverty. So we're going to have to rethink how we understand poverty in important ways. What's also important is that that continent is changing from one that is particularly rural to one that is going to be is going to be predominantly urban. So the way we understand Africa and the way Africans understand themselves has to shift to one which has an urban sensibility. Part of that is that the people who are going to define the African city are going to be young people. Already about half of the people who live in African cities are under 19 years old. Half. And that urban or youth dividend is going to carry on for the next 40 years. It's incredibly exciting in all sorts of ways, but it's also quite a vulnerable, awkward population to manage, especially if those kids don't have jobs, which most of them currently don't. Africa's really important, and what happens in cities is going to be fundamental to the way that money is spent. And Tim made that point. This is the place where most of the climate adaptation funding is going to be spent. It's probably where much of your pension will be spent, investing in and building the cities of Africa, because they are the cities that are still to be built. Exactly how they are built, and whether they are built ethically or not, whether they are built for your interests or for the interests of the residents and occupants of those places, remains to be seen and to be determined. The good news is that probably for the first time ever, African leaders have taken a position which agrees that cities are fundamental to the development path of the continent. The African Union has taken that position. They've embraced Habitat 3. They've embraced the Sustainable Development Goals. And they've said, yes, the urban is the future. And that's really very, very, very different. And so we have an opportunity to have a positive window on the urban future. And that's exciting. The question is, how do we claim that? And I want to leave you with two really important ideas. The one, I think, is that we have to understand the past in order to move productively to the future. In other words, I want to use the idea of an urban palimpsest. You familiar with the idea of a palimpsest? This idea that there's layers, that we can see remnants of what was there before. And the tendency is to only understand one era of urban development in the African continent, that of colonialism. Now, there's no question that colonial development was really, really important. It gave us segregation, it gave us a dual system of land management. But much else has gone on in the continent that remains and structures the way that cities operate. Pre-colonial traditions of tenure with very problematic ideas about gender equity, about the idea of common land, persist and make it very difficult because they are present in parallel with modern systems to understand and make legible investment patterns. Those patterns, those layers, if you like, have become even more complicated with post-independence investments, sometimes in democratic processes, but quite often without any form of local government, or certainly not without a form of comprehensive local government, making it very difficult to understand who runs the city, who actually makes the decisions, who is accountable, whom would you wish to seek as your leaders. I don't have to tell a group of Europeans about how important structural adjustment is, austerity politics, the kinds of things that you see happening in Greece and Portugal, happened in the African context in the 70s and 80s. And there's a long legacy of the experience of what it meant to have savage cuts in urban investment, in the civil service, in the structures which run basic service provision like water and housing. Those have left indelible marks on the way that African cities are positioned to manage their growth going forward. And so that palimpsest has got not just that pre-colonial tradition, not just the colonial era, but also this era of structural adjustment, lots of influence even of what you would see as traditional neoliberal policies, which you would be familiar with in terms of things like pricing and full cost recovery, but cuts to private sector, to higher education, which have eroded and corroded African capacity to take up the African challenge. So and now we sit with an era in which the major investors in the African city, great to have investment in the African city, but they're accountable, whether it's to Chinese investors or to the New York stock market, not necessarily to local interests. And those things all happen and don't disappear. They coexist and manifest very differently in different kinds of places. So understand the urban palimpsest in order to manage the future. What does that mean in practical terms? And I think that's the message that's coming out of the African context and out of scholars and practitioners working there is to say, we want more than utopian ideas about the city. We want utopian ideas. We want a normative base. We want a value system. And we're very happy, is what African leaders are saying, to, for the first time, have a universal understanding of human rights that gives African residents the same kind of health entitlements, the same kinds of housing entitlements as residents of cities in other parts of the world. But we need to understand what we have to be able to do practically if we're going to make advances. And so the idea is being put forward that we have to confront our deficits, acknowledge our demons, be very specific about the capacities that we need to build in African cities in order to address that issue. Because without these people, without these institutions, without these resources, we will not make the kinds of long-standing reforms that are fundamental, not just to those residents, but to this much wider agenda, which, as Tim has suggested, recognizes that what goes on in Kinshasa is absolutely fundamental to the well-being of people of Glasgow or Birmingham. What kinds of deficits are we talking about? We're talking about very practical things here. We're talking about things like, do we have the right ideas? Do we understand the issues facing the African city? And I would challenge those of you who work or practice in positions of urban authority to say, are we training the people who are going to be the consultants who are going to land up doing as much of the work in African cities as African professionals themselves? Are they equipped with the right kinds of knowledge to make a difference? Are we in a position to structure our finances in a way that incentivizes investment in the building of African cities, or are we going to rebuild the shopping malls of New York with the money that is floating around waiting for a place to invest, because that's seen to be a safer investment? We know we need massive legislative reform in order to establish legitimate, credible, and enforceable policies that don't try and pretend to put in place standards which are unaffordable, which are unsustainable to the residents which are there. We need a whole new generation of urban professionals. We can talk about the elite and the role of the elite. Where are the architects? Where are the engineers? Where are the IT specialists who are going to set up the systems which are going to manage Lagos, Johannesburg, those kinds of places? Perhaps most importantly, we have a leadership deficit. And some of that is about getting that younger generation of people excited about the city, excited about the idea of building places which serve a public good, not just for this generation, but for those generations to come. And so perhaps just in conclusion, if I would suggest to you that what we need to leave you with is this idea that our cities are interconnected, that Africa is the crucible of the urban future. If you get it wrong there, it doesn't matter how finely you tune your sustainable investments in Stockholm or London. If you get it wrong in Nairobi, it's not going to help for anybody. That's the first thing. To do that is the second thing. Africans and the global community need a much more honest assessment of what investment in the future requires in order to build what we would want to see as cities of the future. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Great. Can you hear me? So I'm going to focus on Lagos and the future of Lagos. And I just want to give you a couple of facts about Lagos so that we have some idea of the city that I'm talking about. I'm sure most of you have read about it, seen it on TV, even if you've been there as well. But I just want to give you some hard facts about it. So it's a port city, originated as a collection of islands. It is the financial center of Nigeria. It's not the capital of Nigeria. It has a population of about, well, that's debatable. The World Bank says it's about 17 million. The Lagos state government says it's about 21.2 million, which is a vast difference. But I already know as well that going to different communities, that some communities were not counted in the last census. And those are informal settlements, and those actually have large populations in themselves. So already that number of 21.2 million is probably wrong. And therefore means there's actually a lot more than that. There are 20 local government areas. However, those local governments don't necessarily have much power because they don't have enough money to deal with their communities. It has a tropical climate. It's 60% under sea level. 60% of the landmass under sea level. The economy is the largest in Nigeria, Lagos, and I think it's the 6th largest economy in Africa or something like that, which means it's larger than some cities and some countries. Sorry, not cities, countries. There is a housing deficit, a large housing deficit, and Lagos State has started to think about this housing deficit, which they haven't thought about it in the past 10, 15 years in terms of social housing, which is quite dramatic and quite worrisome. And they've now started thinking about it, but even with that thought, they're still focusing on social housing, but for the middle income and not for the lower income or people who are in informal the economy. In terms of transport, imagine trying to move 25 million people around a city. That is just absolutely insane. And if the public transport in itself is not robust, it's not able to handle that number of people, as most people know, which a lot of people know about Lagos, is that there's a lot of traffic. A journey that might take 10 minutes will end up taking 2 hours. So, there's a large infrastructure deficit. So, therefore, we did some interviews with Playable City Watershed earlier this month, and we also asked people, what are their issues? What is your problem? What's your problem with Lagos? What is Lagos missing? And a lot of people obviously raised up traffic, they raised up public transport, they raised up flooding due to drainage levels. They raised up all these different things, which really mainly about infrastructure. And then they also raised up something about harassment. So people would walk into an area, come off the bus in an area, and people will ask them, oh, do you have money to pay me for coming into my area? So therefore, it's even about communities and culture and how do you integrate 22 million people into one city. So I started thinking about what is the state doing about this? What are they actually trying to create? What kind of future do they see for Lagos? And they've created a 2020 plan. But I must criticize the 2020 plan. It's great that they're thinking about the future and thinking about how to develop Lagos into a city that is multicultural, is able to deal with infrastructure, able to deal with the amount of people, able to deal with the deficits going on. But, however, they didn't ask the people, what do they think about Lagos? What do they want from Lagos? How do they want to plan the city? The state itself developed this plan, which is a great plan, but they haven't even gone to the grassroots to really understand what is happening in the city. Then there's governance as well. So there's a missing statement, which I think Sue has started to also touch on in terms of governance and layers of governance. So there is the state, which is Nigeria, the country, the federal government, which is Nigeria, there's a state, and then there's local government. And then how do these tiers actually start to work together? And is there some disconnect? And there is completely a disconnect because previously the federal government was of a different party. The state government of a different party to the federal government, and then there's a local government who, as I mentioned before, doesn't really have much power to actually deal with their community. They haven't got the money, they can't make decisions. So really, in the last 10 years, Lagos has decided to move away from the federal state and decide to create its own economy. They collect their own taxes separate to federal government. They're now generating power, again, separate to the state government. The issues in terms of roads and bridges, they've started building those themselves. So they've allowed themselves to create a country actually within a country in itself so that they can think about their future. But however, this has disconnected them from the rest of Nigeria. So even if you go an hour outside of Lagos, you're in a different state. But however, you have no relation to those people. And if Lagos is thinking about, which it is, it's growing so large that it's actually coming to the fringes of the next state, how do you get people to, if they live in the next state, now commute to Lagos? So those are the kind of issues that are happening. And then there's a disconnect between people who make decisions and people who live within the city, as I mentioned. There's also systematic deficiencies. So there are different aims between different agencies. Therefore, the agencies who are doing roads might be fixing roads one day, and then a month later, they're now fixing electricity poles, or they're now fixing internet. What's it called? Cables. Thank you. Internet cables. So they're continuously disrupting the infrastructure development in the city and the people's movement in the city. But however, there should be some kind of synergy between all the different agencies. People are definitely not in the center of the future of Lagos at the moment, which is drastic and dramatic, and it's going to be a terrible shame for the city if this doesn't change. And so really, when I think about the future of Lagos and when I think about what's going on between the state government, the civil society, private sector, they're all very segregated and they're not coming together to think about the future in itself. Lagos State has a vision of the future which is based on the economy. It's based on how do you get a city to earn to become a business, basically. How do you get a city to become a business rather than how do you get a city to work for its citizens? How do you get a city where citizens are happy to live there? How do you get a city that's livable rather than thinking about the economy and how do you make a city a business? And we can see that from things like Eco Atlantic, which I'm not sure if a lot of you know about this, but Lagos is building another city next to it. And they're dredging from the sea, from the Atlantic Ocean, sand to sandfill basically another island. And this is one of about 3 or 4 islands which are already planned. And so you think about what's actually happening to the old city, or should we call it, I don't know, the Lagos that is there now, to the old Lagos. What will happen to that Lagos when this new city, brand new city, which is they're describing as a smart city, a city of the future, a city of of great people, of large companies, but then what about the old city? What happens to that city? Is that the city of the poor people? Is that the city of the urban poor? I mean, it then adds more divides and doesn't actually integrate the different sections of Lagos. And then there's also another doctrine which is different architects and urban planners are now thinking about, which is water cities, especially because Lagos is pretty much about 4 or 5 islands brought together. They're thinking about if climate change as the sea level rises, climate change is getting worse, sea level is rising. What does happen? What happens to Lagos? Does Lagos become a city that is literally underwater, apart from this new Lagos? I mean, I don't know what happened. But then, so there's this doctrine about that. Okay, we actually need to move away from thinking about land, thinking about how do we move around a city, and think about a city in terms of cars, but think about a city in terms of water. Think about a city in terms of water transport. Think about a city in terms of houses on stilts. Think about a city in terms of connectivity through water. So I think the idea of Lagos as in the future isn't necessarily one that is shiny and glossy and as Lagos State would like us to believe, but actually it might be one of chaos and drama, and as Sue also said, of dysfunction. And then where do we stand? Where do the urban planners stand? Where do the economists stand? Where do the designers stand? Where do the architects stand? Are they designing for houses on stilts? Are they designing for a different kind of urban environment? So I think that's it from me. Sorry to cut it short, but yeah.
So I want to look at life in cities in no small part through the prism of death. I recently written a book that doesn't come out until next year, premised on the fact that every day in America 7 young people are shot dead, on average, every day. And I picked a day at random, and then I pursued the stories of these young people who had been shot. There were 10 children on the day that I chose, which was November the 23rd, 2013, Saturday. 8 of whom were killed in cities. 7 were black, 2 were Latino, 1 was white. These were only the ones that I found. I dare say there were more. But the nature in which these deaths were understood or even known about was very telling. I lived in Chicago for the last 4 years, and sometimes I would get kind of panicked messages from friends saying, "Are you okay? I've heard that 12 people got shot this weekend, shot dead." And if I hadn't been paying attention to the news, I probably wouldn't know, because they didn't die in my part of Chicago. And American cities are built that way. They're built in a way that means that you really need to know what's happening somewhere else, that it's almost happening to somebody else, which is why something like Black Lives Matter can erupt in a way that it has and shock as many people as it has, because it's not that there's been an increase in the number of police killings. It's that there's an awareness now that there wasn't before, that what was happening in one part of the city that you may live in, or that these things were happening in one part of the city, but it's a city that you live in, and you were in no way aware. One medical practitioner that I spoke to in Chicago referred to the number of young people who were coming to her with undefined or ill-defined ailments that she could only put down to being psychosomatic. And then she would see the tattoos on their arms, R.I.P. tattoos, for fallen friends. And she concluded that to a certain degree they were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, that they had, as had most of the children in the book that I've written, knew at the age of 14 or 15 other people who had been shot dead. And so understood their lives in that sense. Live young, die fast, have a good looking corpse. Far more risky behavior, from everything from sexual practice to carrying guns. And so the story I'm going to tell is the story of a young man called Samuel Bradman who lived and died in Dallas. He was shot in the evening as he walked a friend home. They'd had an evening of playing Uno, drinking cocoa, watching We're the Millers, and then Samuel had walked his friend halfway back to his grandmother's. At a certain point, a white Lincoln had turned its lights on, started moving, shot Samuel, and just kept going. Nobody knows why. Samuel was in no way related to anything gang-like, or he was walking down the road and he got shot. And what was remarkable about Samuel's death was that it got, I did count the number, but I think it was about 54 words in the Dallas Morning News. Could have been 80, certainly wasn't more than 100, and that was it. And I found the person that wrote those words, and I said, well, you know, what do you think was going on there? And she said, and I understand this as a journalist, she said, it's not that unusual that somebody would be shot in that area. So you get into this question of news. You know, they say news isn't dog bites man, it's man bites dog. But after a while, people stop asking the question, well, why do these dogs keep biting people? And who controls these dogs? And shouldn't we do something about this dog problem? And so here we had this event, and this was true of most of the deaths that day, that I would be the only person following the story up beyond the initial report. And the reporters would be, you know, combing through their notebooks, you know, and I'd say, did you follow it up? Did you call the police or whatever? And they would say, no, this is not really news there. And then there was a question of how Samuel's family ended up there, which was itself a story of what it's like to live in a city in America, which is that his mother had a job, and they lived in a fairly affluent suburb, or a reasonably middle-class suburb of Dallas. But then her boss was done for Medicaid fraud, and she was told by the lawyers, you know what, you should go, because otherwise you are going to get ensnared in this too. Not that she had done anything wrong. And so she took that time to get an operation that she knew would take some healing. And while she was healing, she was rear-ended by an undocumented migrant, which meant no insurance, which meant very little payout. She ruptured her knee, and so she couldn't work, just as she was recovering from this operation. She couldn't work, and her unemployment ran out. With no unemployment, she had no money. With no money, she had no rent. She was evicted. She stayed with her sister for a little while, but there's only so long 2 adults and 5 kids can live in a 2-bedroom house. And then she ended up with shock credit that would only be taken in the kind of area where your child might be shot dead, and no one would take any notice. And so I just want to read glasses. a little bit from the chapter on Samuel. This is less the product of malign neglect than the unconscious omissions born from the dead weight of power and privilege that makes the poor and dark in American cities invisible. In short, there are places in almost every American city where children and teens are expected to get shot. Areas where the deaths of young people by gunfire does not contradict a city's general understanding of how the world should work, but confirms it. To raise children there, whether they're involved in criminal activity or not, is to incorporate those odds into your daily life. Your existence as a working class African American makes you vulnerable. Your presence in areas where working class African Americans are most likely to live renders you collateral. By the numbers, writes Jesmyn Ward in The Men We Reaped, by all the official records, here at the confluence of history, of racism, of poverty and economic power, this is what our lives are worth. Nothing. What's most striking about Dallas, writes Harvey Graff in Dallas, The Dallas Myth, The Making and Unmaking of an American City, is not its difference from other US megalopolises, but rather its exaggeration of features that many contemporary cities share. There is no city as a whole. Fractured along lines of class as well as race and ethnicity, the cityscape is composed of a myriad of non-communicating fragments. These fragments, while disparate, this is me now, and dispersed in a range of ways, can crudely be divided into two distinct areas: the rich white north and the poor black and Latino south. Molly Ivins, a Texas-based journalist, wrote, "There is a black Dallas, a Chicano Dallas, a Vietnamese Dallas, a gay Dallas, there's even a funky bohemian Dallas, but mostly there is North Dallas, a place so materialistic and Republican it makes your teeth hurt. The disgrace of Dallas today is that it's probably the most segregated city this side of Johannesburg." Indeed, in their 1993 book, American Apartheid, Segregation and the Making of the Underclass, Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton presented 5 distinct dimensions in which segregation might be measured. 16 cities fit the designation. Dallas was one of them, as were 3 of the other cities where teens died on that day. Black Americans in these metropolitan areas live within large contiguous settlements of densely inhabited neighborhoods that are packed tightly around the urban core. In plain terms, they live in ghettos, they write. Ironically, within a large, diverse, and highly mobile post-industrial society such as the US, blacks living in the heart of the ghetto are among the most isolated people on earth. Finally, Peter Gent in North Dallas 40 writes about South Dallas. The South Dallas blacks aren't a deprived ethnic group. They're a different civilization living in captivity. Just blocks from the phenomenal wealth of Elm and Commerce Streets, South Dallas was a hyperbole, a grim joke on those who still believe we are all created equal. The blacks seemed to be waiting, watching, knowing they would always be getting fucked. They took solace in that dependability. Thank you.
The power of a story which, moving from the world scale to one person in their experience is obviously very powerful, and I think you've seen the range of contributions that we've had from us on our side of the room. We do have, thank you very much for keeping to time. We did start a little bit late, but we do have some time for questions. If you wave your hands vigorously, we do have a roving microphone, the front there.
Thank you very much. My name is Robin Hambleton. I'm a Professor of City Leadership at the University of the West of England. I'd like to thank all the speakers for great presentations. I think I might be a bit biased here in being interested in leadership, and Susan made a really interesting point about a leadership deficit. And it would be great to hear a bit more about how to respond to that deficit, and I think maybe particularly in the situation that Gary was describing, where some communities are so disadvantaged it's difficult to see the way forward. But my suggestion is local place-based leadership is the most important issue for cities. So perhaps we could hear a comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, to take a couple of other questions if there are before we ask the panel to respond. Gentleman there. There's some lights there, so if you're in that part of the room, wave vigorously.
My name is Richard Essex. I come from Cardiff. I'll follow up from that last comment. I mean, I think when you hear people talking about cities of 21 to 25 million, you begin to wonder whether they are one specific entity. And I think the question raised by the previous speaker about placemaking and the comments made by Gary about the differences between different areas within cities and the range of situations between those that are very wealthy and those that are very poor. Those are key issues that need to be addressed by how we're going to take forward the future of not only British cities but cities throughout the world.
Yeah, great point, thank you. One more? If not, sorry, yep.
Yes, Malcolm Moore, I'm an urban design consultant. As Olamide was saying about Lagos, it seems that the idea of, that the old city is so difficult to handle, and especially in formal settlements, that better just to sort of go and build a new one and then hope the old one just sorts itself out. How do we overcome this problem that investment only interested in shiny new cities which are some distance from the problematic existing cities which have got to be made to work somehow?
Thanks. I think for me what the questions highlight in very different kinds of ways is that when we move into a world that is predominantly urban, we would expect that leadership becomes predominantly urban. Now that means all sorts of things, because it means cities are very complex and they are made up of specialist knowledge and they are made up of the interfaces of those specialist knowledges. They're made up of lived experiences on the ground, and they're made up of processes which operate at different kinds of scales. And for me, the challenge is actually not to say what form of leadership or action is the most important, but rather to ensure that the multiplicity of skills and leadership that we require are realized. So some of that is local leadership. But there's been a push for local leadership, and it's a non-negotiable. You cannot have effective urban spaces if the fundamental building block of the city doesn't work well. But that's a necessary for me, but not a sufficient condition. And what I think is so interesting in the African context is that quite often local leadership is actually very effective. They've been doing a great job in the absence of any other kind of leadership. And it's on that basis that people survive. The much more complicated question is, what do you begin to do when you have large, complex systems, whether it's Lagos per se, or whether it's that western belt, that urban agglomeration on the west coast? What do you do when our global system of cities is what happens in China has ramifications across the world. Whether it's on emissions, whether it's on global trade markets, we are interconnected in our urban lives. And it seems to me that one of the things that we need to do collectively is to ensure that we understand the points of connection, whether it's between health and environment, whether it's between the neighborhood and the city, whether it's between national strategies that you were talking about, and some of the global processes. And so that would be my response. Deal with the complexity.
Yeah. Can I bring Olamide in? 21 million people, or is it 25 in Lagos? Is it possible to talk about that as one place?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about that as one place. However, as a city-state, the way it's governed is as if it's one space. So as I mentioned, even though there are 20 local governments, they don't have the power, they don't have the money, they don't have the resources to actually deal with that space. But as Sue was mentioning, actually, that local leaders are actually they motivate their community. They work very well within their community. So it's about enhancing that, giving them a little bit more resources, giving them a little bit more power, giving them a little bit more leeway to actually work with their communities to develop their communities, rather than still leaving it very top-heavy. I mean, I think this is, in terms of academics, the academic doctrine, this is very normal in terms of devaluating power. So I think, yeah, that's pretty much how to deal with that. And I think you also mentioned placemaking, and I think it's definitely something that needs to start to come into the discussion. I mean, it already has within urban planning and urban issues, but it's extremely important, especially for a city as large as Lagos, or even actually any city, to start thinking about placemaking. It's actually, yeah, it's very important.
Gary, there's something of a paradox as well in the way you were describing the divisions, because on the one hand, these big cities, they represent massive comings together of economic activity, of people and habitation. Something brings everybody together in these dense settlements, and yet at the same time they generate these divisions and these fractures and the violence. Is that just inevitable in the way that cities work, or?
I think so long as there is a range of forms of segregation in a society, they'll be replicated in the city. I think for cities to work, though, they have to have some sense of a common narrative that they can all tell themselves about what is this Londoniness, for example, that keeps us all together, which would be a sense of sometimes would be, if we take London, which to me feels like a foreign city now, because I've just come back after 12 years, and I never had kids in London before, and now I do. And it seems that one of the stories that London people, and I'm not from London also, one of the things that London people tell themselves is that they're not from somewhere else in England. That's a key definition of being in London, that you're not somewhere else. It's also that you are part of a diverse in a range of ways, that you have access to some kind of diversity. And that means very different things to different people. So while I do think there's a common narrative, people aren't necessarily telling themselves the same story. So if you are on the outer fringes of London, you're telling yourself a different story about diversity. It may be something that you fear. I'm just really looking at election results, actually, as an indication. Whereas if you are in Hackney, where I live, then it would be understood to be something that you are much more that you are engaged in and that you are there for. And my guess is that every city, whether it's Dallas or London or Lagos, there has to be a story that, or strands of a story that everybody in that place can have access to in order to make it work, even if the lived experience of being in that city is completely different from it.
We are out of time, but I'm going to give Tim just the last word briefly, if you would.
Two very quick points. One on Lagos, because I was looking at Lagos recently, and I was struck by the fact that the UN still try and just describe it as being a city of 12 million people, and that highlights the issue of data, lack of knowledge about complex cities, a huge problem. The second thing is, a lot of the large cities, there's a huge range of models for how they manage themselves. But I think the key thing is that the really fragmented ones always suffer to some extent, and that the ones that do have at least some metropolitan or regional dimension do begin to start creating that kind of shared purpose, that shared identity that Gary spoke about.
Yeah. Great. We've clearly only scratched the surface in the hour that we were allowed, but in doing so, I think it's raised lots of questions in my mind, certainly, and I'm sure for you as well. It remains me only to thank you for coming, but particularly to thank our speakers who kept to time and I think provided fascinating accounts on world cities from different perspectives in next to no time. So thank you all very much indeed. That was great.